The GovX Show is supported by Forrester, helping government organisations perform at their best. Visit forrester.com to learn more.
Hello again. Welcome to another episode of the GovX Show. I'm Tim Coulthard, Community Director here at GovX Digital and your regular host on the show. We're going to be talking data today. But quick clue, it's not just about technology. It's about people, it's about culture, it's about processes, it's about understanding your objectives. To help us understand how to unlock the power of data in government organisations, we have a couple of experts in the field. Andrew Sadler and Ed Pikett from our friends at Hitachi Solutions work with public sector organisations across the UK to help them really unlock the value of the data that they're all accumulating at huge rates. And some organisations are making better progress than others in terms of using that data to unlock insights that deliver better impact and better results for the end user. So we're going to jump into that conversation with Ed and Andrew shortly. Just a quick note to say that they joined us for the Government Data Show recently for a session on data-driven productivity. There is an on-demand session now available to view if you want to catch that. So I'll put the link to that in the show notes accompanying this episode. Plug out of the way, let's jump into the conversation with Ed and Andrew. Andrew, Ed, welcome to the GovX Show. Great to have you joining us today for a conversation.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Pleasure to have you. So we're going to be exploring a topic that's, I guess, growing in interest, growing in relevance right now, which is how data, lots of government data around, how is it now kind of kicking on to the next gear in terms of driving real productivity increases? We've all sort of seen the amount of data that government organisations are storing and collecting, but now it's time for that rubber to hit the road and start sort of delivering in terms of increased outputs, increased effectiveness. So excited to sort of drill into some of that stuff. But before we do, let's set the scene a bit and find out a bit more about you both. Really keen to hear about how your roles fit into Hitachi Solutions, what your areas of focus are, what your areas of expertise are, and how you're working with the public sector. So Andrew, maybe you could take the first stab at that and tell us a bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Andrew Sadler. I've been in the data space 20 odd years. I think 24 years, I think last time I was counting. We have a team of approximately 40 data professionals across the board that span from data engineers, data scientists, analysts, data modelers, and more recently, a whole load of data visualization and UX specialists in terms of understanding interaction with data. Data is a core to what we do, and it's a core to our business. It's a central pillar, if you like. I hate to use the term "data is the new oil" because I think that's very, very zeitgeisty and a bit crass even. But it is a core asset to what our customers and prospects use. And so I think it needs to be treated as an asset. And that's what me and my team do. We help people realize that asset and realize the value within that. And specifically in the public sector, we tend to span both central gov, local gov, services, so the likes of police, fire, etc., housing associations. In the team, we've got experience around NHS as well, and there's a whole load of things that I'm sure we'll probably talk about from a pandemic perspective. But more interestingly, our team also spans non-public sector specialisms as well. So the reason for bringing that up in this forum is that actually there's a whole load of analyses that we bring to bear from some of our non-governmental industrial knowledge. So I'm thinking things like stuff from retail, single customer view is very easily applicable to a single citizen view, for example, or a single patient view. Or so there's lots of analyses that we bring from the commercial sector that we also work into our government areas as well.
Yeah, interesting. And that crossover piece, we might touch on that again later. I know also like financial services, there's an interesting parallel there where the relationship between the institution and the customer, necessarily wasn't the greatest, but they've done a huge amount of work in terms of improving the interface, in terms of improving those touch points with customers. And I think governments are certainly following in their stead, and there's a lot of learning, a lot of crossover there. So that might be a theme we return to later on.
Sure.
Ed, great to have you joining us as well. Maybe you could tell us a bit about your role with Hitachi Solutions and your areas of focus as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, and thanks for having us today. So I'm Ed Pikett. I'm the Director of Central Government at Hitachi Solutions. I'm actually relatively new here, about 4 or 5 months in, but essentially I look after a lot of our business development in the digital space, but also some of the strategy aligning with central government policy, making sure that we are in tune with the changes, the developments, with making sure that some of the things that we are perhaps most, that I guess our skill sets and our capabilities align with the needs of government and the needs of citizens, is how I best describe it. But before joining, I spent 12, 13 years as a civil servant in various departments, in Cabinet Office and Number 10, but finishing up most recently as the CDO in the Department for International Trade. So I spent a good chunk of my time wrestling with all of the challenges that our sort of civil servants and our public sector workers wrestle with every day. I haven't moved that far away from it. Obviously, I'm just on the other side of it, sort of gamekeeper come poacher.
Yeah. You're that bridge between the two worlds, and sort of keeping everybody honest in terms of that civil servant perspective. So I imagine you're a valuable asset for the team there, and they come and knock in. Yeah, Andrew's nodding there. So yeah,
well,
absolutely.
And hopefully a valuable asset, because you have a lot of sympathy for the problems that I guess the sort of digital data technology officials are the real world of what it's like working within a department as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Andrew, you mentioned, Hitachi Solutions works across the sort of public sector, and public sector is a big space, right? You can think about central government and Whitehall, but then you also have multiple agencies and associated organizations, police, emergency services, health, huge gamut of organizations with some common challenges, some different challenges. Interesting to find out now a bit about, drill into that a bit more. What are some of the organizations that you're working with, and what are those challenges that they're facing now? And on the flip side, what are the opportunities they have? Huge amount going on, lots of digital transformations happened, accelerated during the pandemic. But what are the kind of key points and standout ideas that are happening in the conversations that you're having right now with the public sector?
Wow. There's quite a lot in that to unpick. How long have we got? So I suppose one thing that is worth saying around some of the challenges that some of the organizations that we're working with are having are that there is huge commonality between some of those challenges. You called out that distinction between common problems and specific bespoke problems. I'll talk a little bit about the common problems first. And it's difficult really, because they do seem quite trite, but they are actually very genuine problems of people being able to use data effectively and getting the right value out of that information and the hidden information that sits within data, being able to get timely data. So we spend quite a lot of time thinking about how to right time data, so get it just in time for the organization. Don't tend to talk too much about real-time data, because officially speaking, there is no such thing as real time. There's always a delay, and there's always latency. So we do talk about different grains of latency, if you like, and the appropriate timeliness of that data for that particular organization. So that may be very different if it's data that only changes on a monthly basis, versus therefore the latency of that only needs to be at that grain, versus something that might be changing minute by minute, second by second, and therefore that latency at that level has a significant value associated with it. So it's about getting it right for the right timeliness of that data. Accuracy is key as well. So making sure that if you consider data as an asset, then it's key to make sure that it's a high quality asset and that it has high internal reliability and validity. And both of those are key measurements for us in terms of our success of delivering accurate data. And then over and above that, there's the usefulness of the data. So does it answer the so what question? We have a bit of a, again, it's trite, but have a mantra, if you like, in the data team at Hitachi Solutions, where it's about answering the so what question. So always coming back to, are we making life better for the individuals that need to be made better for? So in this case, are we doing something that actually delivers significant values in terms of outcome for the individuals?
Yeah.
So there's some of the common threads through it. To just talk a little bit more specifically, so I'm thinking specifically around what we've been doing during the pandemic. There's been some really interesting rapid development that we've done for local councils to right at the beginning of the pandemic to help them with managing shielding people. And obviously there's a significant amount of data integration from both NHS and social care networks, etc., into systems of care management or case management, if you like, for those shielded people. We helped build something called the Vulnerability Hub for local councils, and we had to do that because of the pandemic in a very rapid and agile manner, agile in the non-project management sense of it.
Lowercase a, yeah.
Exactly, but also it was managed that way as well, but it was a templated approach to be able to provide a rapid service there out for multiple councils. And then obviously the other area around everything that's been going on with the pandemic is around integration with some of that health data versus social care data versus adult social care or child social care as well. There's all sorts of angles to joining data together into common data models to support that for those sort of customers of ours.
Yeah, interesting. And Ed, obviously you've come at it from a different perspective, having been on the other side as well. Now, what's your take on how organizations are facing up to the challenges around data? What are you seeing? What are you hearing in terms of conversations? I think you're muted.
In terms of public sector, casting my mind back to DIT days, there were pretty common sort of problems to do with identity. For us, it was about business identity rather than person identity, citizen identity, and a lot of issues around permissions. Who has the permission to act on behalf of a particular business? I think within that you can segment it down to data standards, to data integration across departments, different needs of different businesses, talking to the same business multiple times, or talking to the same individual within a business multiple times. So I think, I'm sure we'll come on to the work of the Data Standards Authority and the work of business identity later on. But I guess coming at this from a slightly different angle rather than the data specific one, I think problems that departments seem to be wrestling with a lot of capability and skills. We talk about skills shortage. I don't think many people would argue that there is a data skills shortage in this country, not just in the public sector, but in the private sector. They're some of the most sought after people you can have in any organization. And when I say capability, this is no disregard for the individual skills that the civil servants have, but there's not enough of them. And they are incredibly in demand across government. Data scientists, data architects, data modelers, all of these roles that didn't really even feature in government sort of HR organograms until relatively recently, if I'm being honest. And if you look at things like the sort of a lot of the capability reviews in HR, the roles didn't exist within the kind of the service standard, because the service standard was very much design focused, not data focused. So I think trying to unpack some of that, trying to recognize and understand where those skill shortages are, trying to do development and capability building for internal departments, trying to attract people from the private sector into the public sector, dare I say it, so that the public sector isn't as reliant on on consultants like us and agencies, suppliers, contractors. So you build in that pipeline of talent coming through from a young age. So I think it's to coin a pretty obvious phrase, it's a bit of a journey. It's not going to be solved overnight, but there needs to be some very careful consideration, looking at benefits, pay, the whole sort of remit of sort of, I guess, drivers and interventions that the government can play to improve the situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to build on something Ed said there, I think it's a really interesting area for us as a consultancy to help build the capability within some of these departmental areas. So, to not just do work for them, but also help them to be able to do that for themselves and become self-sufficient. And that's a crucial way that we do a lot of our work now. A lot of it is about building capability within the teams that we're working within.
Yeah, and leaving behind that legacy of, we haven't just executed project A, but we've also left behind the skills and the understanding of how to do it, in-house further down the line potentially.
Exactly, and keeping that fresh, right? So we're obviously off to the next project, and we're learning each project and our skills that my team is far cleverer than I am now, and a bit long in the tooth for it myself, but actually the keeping those skills fresh within our team means that we can then continue to maintain ongoing relationships and keep it fresh within the organizations that we work within as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And picking up on a couple of those points there in terms of the capability within government, and also the sort of, I suppose, the digital intent in government, if you like. The Declaration of Government Reform came around a month or two back, and there were lots of references to digital and data, and a sort of a sort of signal of intent that they would be built into the heart of the way organizations and departments run and projects and that sort of thing, which is a good thing to hear. And a lot of that, I suppose, was driven by the need, over the past 18 months for public sector organizations to spin up new services, to pivot to digital rapidly, and so on. What's your sense of what's been learned in terms of that process? Some of the conversations we've had, it's been, well, we produced X service in a hurry, and now we have to embed it and sort of solidify it and make it parts of business as usual, as opposed to sort of crisis management. What are some of the key learning points that you've been hearing coming out of government agencies since the pandemic, in terms of what they did differently and what they might look to build on in the future? Now we're, touch wood, sort of moving into a new normal. Another big one there.
Yeah. That's an interesting document, isn't it? That declaration. What was it, 18 references to data directly in it, or something like that? It's it makes for interesting reading. Things like I called out a couple of quotes which I just kept up on my screen just as a reference here. But we must do better at pooling and sharing data so we can analyze in depth the impact of our policies. We must do better at making our data available so that we can be more effectively held to account.
Unpack that. Yeah.
I mean, there's some really good stuff within that, and there's some really good intent.
Yeah.
And there's, looking at measurable outcomes rather than successful budgetary angle, which is an interesting angle that calls out. Pooling and sharing data, interesting use of the word pooling within that document as well. I mean, is there a little nod there to data lakes? Are we talking about data swamps? Or even are we going a bit more modern, thinking about data meshes, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, there's all sorts of bits of that we could unpick. I think for me that there's some interesting things around intent, around sharing and joining up of multiple data sets. As we know from all of our experiences with, I was going to say specifically Gov, but it goes much wider than that. People tend to generate silos of data, and actually understanding the cross effect of the data from multiple different silos is difficult. And when you then start talking about sharing data sets together, you end up having to approach that shared bit of data as more than the sum of the parts, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's some interesting considerations around security of shared data and security of pooling data as a service. I also think the intent in the declaration is interesting when you think about the outcomes for a government. So obviously governments are governed by this cyclical nature, and typically measuring those outcomes therefore gets pushed into a relatively short term-ish outcome. So it's certainly within the electoral kind of like window, if you like. So there's some considerations around that, meaning that analyses of things like time series effectiveness and the outcomes in that time series become important. That's certainly something that needs to be considered. I did like how they pull out specific items to mission up the what do they call it? Their mission is to level up the country, and they call out things like educational outcomes, attracting investment, building infrastructure, supporting families is an interesting one as well. If you look at pulling together social data, social care data, and other data sets that local councils might have to support troubled families or families under difficulty. They also call out things like health service bounce back in that document, which again, I think is an interesting angle. And how do you know if it's bouncing back? How do you know if it's effective? Well, that has to be driven by effective pre and post data analysis, in my mind. That's the thing that drives whether or not you're actually being successful in that process. So there's a lot in that, but it was good to see a lot of those intentions coming out through that document. I think the real test will be the policies to support that, and that's where things like the data standards piece might come in, and that might be an interesting point for us to jump into that conversation. Particularly if you're then looking at what they're saying around sharing data, the open data standardization of that, I think becomes crucial.
And Ed, what's your take on it? You having been there at the coalface, as it were, some good signals, good intent. What's your thoughts on where public sector goes next in terms of being driven by a more positive approach to data and digital from the government's declaration, but also how it's learned from the sort of rapid acceleration in the last 18 months?
So I think a few different things. I think everyone recognises that sort of perfect storm from an operational side of the house, Brexit into COVID. The need to deliver things rapidly, the need to look at innovative ways of solving problems. I know when I was at DIT, something that I was on the digital side, but something that we discussed with my chief data officer. We discussed the potential of saying that actually before we considered building any products or services, most products or services have an underpinning data set of some description. We would have to investigate taking the underpinning data and making it public via API first. So actually then you see how is that data used, and then what kind of service do you need to build on the back of it. So actually you're beginning to approach problems not from a design perspective necessarily, but from a data perspective and a research perspective, and I guess in parallel looking at design. So I think that the lens by which government departments are looking at problem solving has probably shifted. I think in terms of a skills piece, we've seen that develop through the whole government. If you look at 10, 15, 20 years ago, DDAT leaders were very much IT leaders. And then they probably went into more technology leaders, and then perhaps moved into being actual commercial leaders, because a lot of government was buying services. And then they went into design and digital leaders, and perhaps maybe the next step is our future DDAT leaders need to actually be data leaders. And that skill set perhaps needs to spread out across the civil service, so that senior leaders, not just in DDAT, but in HR, in finance, in policy making, need to understand better their responsibilities of being a kind of information asset owner, and the complexities that come with managing and owning and being responsible for large data sets, both the potential of them and the risk that you carry. It back to what Andrew was saying about that kind of in-between lens of merging data sets together, and who's responsible for that. So there's some definitely that skills piece is really important. I think it'll be really interesting, just at a very, very operational level, to see through a data lens how service assessments that take place within government will perhaps change with a greater focus on the importance of the use of data and the handling of data, rather than design, or at least equality when it comes to those two things. I think that'll be a really interesting space. I think there are concerns, and maybe the people who are watching this will be saying, no, you're completely wrong, and I will happily accept that. But I think there are concerns that when you do build products, services for the citizens at such pace, and everyone did such an incredible job at putting those things together, but you're building a huge amount of debt into those services. Often they didn't have the opportunity to test them as much as you might like, to learn from them. If you think about moving at pace, what you want to do is get something live quickly, iterate it through kind of incremental small releases, lots of testing, lots of small changes, not large, great big iterations that have greater ability to perhaps go off down a rabbit hole. So, and if you haven't got that opportunity, you're inherently building sort of technical or debt into those things. So I think there'll be interesting to see how many of those services that were built in that compressed time frame actually might need rebuilding, or at least rethinking once they've had an opportunity to learn, and to be used in anger a bit more. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. So some great stuff happened, but obviously with it, voices of okay, we show what's art of the possible. How do we do this with a bit more control?
And do you feel as though the relationship between public sector and end users is, in a sense, is there no going back in terms of expectations of, I want a single point where I can carry out X, Y, and Z activity with HMRC? I mean, a lot of these services already existed, but others were accelerated. Has it kind of reset the balance and the level of expectation, forevermore digital first, and that's that? I mean, there's lots of reasons why moving away from that physical interaction was the right thing to do anyway. Is your sense there's no going back at this point?
I think, look, I have no data on this, so this is just a thing, but my view would be we probably never had a period in society with a greater scale of capability within the public for digital data technology, from those who have access to absolutely everything, that want everything right now, have all of their apps set up perfectly, can automate things in their house, walk through their door, turn on their lights by talking to them, their toilets connected to the internet, the whole works. And then on the other hand, you've got people that are vulnerable and don't have access to those systems, that are completely dependent and reliant on third parties to support every part of their life. And maps don't have that control that they might like over those lives. And government needs to be really careful, much like it did with accessibility on content and services and the design of them. It needs to be the same with people's use of data, automation of services, how it moves to a push rather than a pull model, where government can intervene before something happens rather than reacting to something happening. I think the kind of ethical debate and conversations around them needs to be very, very considered. And I thoroughly welcome the ambition of government, but these are complex things that need some real thought, some very sort of structured approach, and not just from technical people, not just from digital people, from people who can understand the real life of working and existing in those worlds where you don't have the control that you might have.
Yeah, Andrew, what's your take on that inclusion piece? I mean, obviously, digital folks get very excited and are able to now execute and have a sort of mandate to execute at speed, but we can't develop a kind of two-speed public services approach where there's a digital track and then there's a sort of analog track happening in the background and people don't have the same access. So how do we ensure that inclusion piece remains at the heart of the future of development of digital services and digital programs?
Well, that's the
Sorry about that. I keep bringing you the horribles. But
that's the big question, isn't it? I think there's one point that's worth just adding on top of what Ed just said there, that leads to the discussion of that, but is for some of those vulnerable people that possibly aren't as connected or aren't as aren't able to use some of the digital services. There's an interesting angle around identity from a delegation of authority perspective. So, I think probably would have power of attorney was what we might have described it as once, or maybe still can. I don't know. But when you think about ownership of somebody's data, if you're acting on behalf of somebody, there are some interesting considerations with that around security and ownership, and what that means for citizens who are supporting vulnerable people around them. So I think that's one angle to add on to what Ed said. In terms of other things around inclusion and making sure that we sorry, remind me, your question was about making sure we don't leave people behind. Was that?
Yeah, I mean, the risk, I suppose, is there's an acceleration of digital delivery and sort of digital interface with the majority of citizens, but those that can't do it, how do we make sure that they're not left behind, they're not sort of denied access to services that are becoming digital first, I suppose.
Yeah, I think there is something around education in particular around data literacy, and again, not wanting to try and create a multi-tiered audience, if you like, of these services, but appropriate levels of data literacy are going to be important as we move forward, I think, and making. It was interesting. We were talking earlier about that declaration document. There's a piece in there that talks about making appropriate data visualization tooling and skills for some of the individuals. Now, we've seen some really interesting data visualizations over the last 18 months. Some of them on a daily basis, relatively early on, were had some challenges associated with them. And as a data visualization specialist, I struggled seeing some of those. But so I think there's always things that for us as a country and as individuals to be learning around how we use data and visualize data. I think that is part of this as well, understanding what the data means, how we ask the right questions of it, how those questions are framed in the overall data set. All of these things become key factors to making sure that we're on the level playing field with how we deal with data. That's probably for all the digital lot. For non-digital, then that's a much bigger question, and that's where that sweet spot that Ed was talking about between, again, it's quite a trite thing for a consultancy to say, but it's where people, processes, and technology come together. It's the I can't remember what that model is. It's a McKinsey model, I think, of those three factors coming together. So it's that becomes crucial that that's done right for the people that aren't able to come along with that, and there must and shall be ways, I think, for us to be able to handle that, whether it's external services that can do that, or whether it's a combination of education or open access through centralized services. I mean, even going down to things like the local library and that kind of way, there must be ways and means to provide access to some of this stuff.
Yeah, sure. So as we sort of start to wrap things up, obviously pleased that you're going to be joining us for the Government Data Show conference less than 2 weeks now, just probably every week's time, and particularly around the session around data-driven productivity in government. So let's sort of tee that conversation up a bit so that our audience have their whistles wet by joining us for those debates and conversations in the future. What, in terms of data-driven productivity, what should public sector organizations be thinking about? What are the wins that are there in terms of reducing inputs and increasing outputs? Any sort of standout ones that you want to flag that we can then explore at the conversation in the conference?
Do you want me to make a stab at this first?
Go on, Ed. Yeah.
So I'll give you, I'll start as a very tangible, practical thing before sort of broadening out. I remember when I was in government, and just as I was sort of coming to the end of my time, there was a lot of conversation about what was I believe it was called the API register. Fundamentally, it's a register of data sets with APIs attached to them that people can access, and there were 70 odd of them or something along those lines, and there was a consultation about whether it should be maintained or something along that. And I don't recall the outcome of that. It may be ongoing, but I remember discussing at the time with some of the folks within our team that actually, whereas it's very useful to have a register of data sets with APIs, but what would be more useful is to have a register of data sets without APIs. Because then other government departments or policymakers, folks within data teams, digital teams can actually go look down that and think, great, God, if only I had access to that data set, imagine what I could do with that data. And then they could, in a very government way, task, write a note, write a letter, whatever it is, that team to develop that data set. Now, it's to deliver that into an actual modeled, cleansed data set with an API that could power something else, or they could talk about merging those things together. Now, I think where that becomes interesting, and again, the same issue will lie with that declaration is about prioritization. There are so many things to do for people in DDAT teams across government. Lots of legacy services that are burning platforms coming to end of life that need to be migrated. Lots of data sets that be given to power things, lots of products that need to be built, lots of legacy services that are recent, as I said earlier, that needs to be rebuilt. So actually, how do you then prioritize those things? And one of the barriers to this change, I've always viewed, is the structure of departments being quite siloed. Government is built in these great big towers, and kind of GovX UK is also built in those great big towers, which fundamentally block integration between departments. So it's in the grey area. So perhaps if government could focus on the grey for a while, focus on those interoperabilities, those interactions, those elements that don't conveniently sit within business or farming, and actually how do they work together, and the responsibility for those grey areas, I think we probably do very well. I think people trying to, from a citizen's angle, trying to traverse the kind of oligarchs of government departments is very, very tough. So focusing on that traverse would be really very useful. And data is probably the biggest enabler for that.
And I think there's rich pickings there, right? I mean, in terms of making life better for people, there's huge rich pickings in those joined up silos of data. Yeah. But it needs to be done carefully and cautiously and securely and blah, 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 all that stuff.
Yeah.
I think as well, there's an interesting, based on what you were saying there about your list of APIs, Ed, that in the declaration, there's something about we will create data inventories so that we and everyone knows what data exists. What does it say? What data exists, where it's stored, and how it can be accessed. And that's almost like out of that declaration that is almost heading towards data access being a charter, almost sort of charter territory. And I think that's an interesting area for us to be looking at for making that stuff available as well as we go forward. But the joining up of the silos within that as well is crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Andrew and Ed, I feel like we've covered a lot of ground and yet hardly scratched the surface in other ways as well. It's obviously a huge topic. Hopefully this conversation now will trigger some thoughts in our public sector audience about how they're using data, some of those opportunities that they could still be exploiting. So it's been a great conversation. Great to welcome you onto the show. And just want to say to you both, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us on.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tim. All the best.
Our pleasure. Thanks.